Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Erik Brynjolfsson.
Rudy, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure. Thank you. It's a real delight to be here in Brussels and have a chance to share with all of you some of the research we've been doing at MIT and my group and around the world, really. And I'm especially interested to have a chance to talk to you about some of the things we've been doing on this work on the second machine age in my co-authored book with Andrew McAfee. Let me start with a question for all of you. Who here would like to be able to change the world? Raise your hand if you'd like to be able to change the world. Okay. A lot of people, yeah. So what does it take to be able to change the world? What do we need to do to change the world? Margaret Mead famously said that all it takes is a small group of highly committed people. Steve Jobs had a different answer. He thought it took an insanely great vision. Vladimir Putin thinks it takes an enormous army. So there are a lot of different perspectives on how you can change the world. I'm going to focus on, being from MIT, an engineering perspective. Kind of a little bit more of a wonky, nerdish approach to it. And I'm going to argue that changing the world really requires fundamentally two things: a power system and a control system. A power system is something that helps you physically move around the world. The world is made of atoms, primarily, like the building you have here, out the view out the window. And these atoms are held in force by powerful laws of physics, physics forces, gravity, electromagnetic forces. So moving them requires physical power in big groups, like in a locomotive, or fine-grained, like rearranging things more detailed. But it's not enough to have physical power. You also have to have what engineers call a control system, the mental power to be able to adjust and figure out exactly where you want those atoms to be, where they should be located. So changing the world really boils down to a power system and a control system. Now, if you believe that, then you can look back through history, and a lot of the big changes we've seen make more sense. For much of history, human lives didn't change much until the Industrial Revolution. For the previous millennia, living standards were virtually flat. Sure, there were empires, there were religions, there were kings and queens and emperors. There were even scientific breakthroughs. But the average person really didn't live his or her life very differently in 1700 than thousands of years earlier. But starting in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, living standards started to take off. And the world has never been the same ever since. We are still today enjoying the fruits of a tremendous increase in living standards. We are dozens of times wealthier than our great-great-grandfathers. And that can be traced primarily not to these empires or other changes, but rather to technology. Specifically, in this case, the technology of the steam engine and other technologies that allowed us to bring more physical power to change the world. In other words, the Industrial Revolution was all about augmenting our power systems. Instead of just our own muscles or those of animals, we're able to use machinery to move around the world, move around atoms. And ultimately, the more power we had, physical power, the more we needed humans to decide where they went. These technologies were, in economic terms, primarily a complement to human ingenuity and to human brains. They increased the value of human labor. We're in the midst of what Andy and I are calling the second machine age. And the second machine age is about automating and augmenting not physical power, not our muscles, but the control system, our brains, mental power. You've all seen the kinds of computers, big data, software that are revolutionizing the world in the past couple of decades, and that are increasingly going to change it in the next couple of decades. These are primarily changing the control system, the ability to adjust the world. And a big open question is whether or not these technologies ultimately will be a complement or a substitute for humans, whether they will make our work more valuable or less valuable, whether they will replace what a lot of people do. In many cases, it seems that it has been a complement for technology, for humans, and in other cases, it seems it's clearly been a substitute. When we look at the changes that are happening in the economy today, they make sense in the context of this transformation, this second machine age that we're in the midst of. It is creating tremendous bounty and wealth, as we heard in the introduction from Rudy. It is also creating more inequality and unevenness, as some people benefit and some people don't. Many people, millions of people, are being left behind. In the next few minutes, I want to show you some of the technologies that are at work that surprised me, and I want to talk to you about the economic implications of them for productivity and growth, but also for jobs and inequality. And ultimately, we need to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we need to change society, change our organizations, and our own skills to keep up with these changes in technology. So first, let me talk a little bit about some of the changes that I've seen just in the past 10 years in technology. So let's go back to 2004. I was teaching a class at MIT about what machines can do and what humans can do. And one of the books we used was this wonderful book by Frank Levy and Dick Murnane about the new division of labor. And in that book, and in my class discussion, we identified three main things that humans have a comparative advantage at. One was autonomous mobility, being able to move around and fine motor control, being able to say, pick something up, pick up a pen, or pick up a dime, or a coin from a table. That's easy for even a 5-year-old or a 2-year-old to do. It's difficult or almost impossible for most machines to do. Another big category was language, both understanding language and communicating complex thoughts in written and spoken form. And finally, the third big and perhaps most important category was pattern matching and unstructured problem solving. Sure, you could solve structured problems like adding up numbers with the computer, but an unstructured problem was much more difficult. And the archetypal example that was described in this book as something that humans could do, but in 2004, no one saw that machines would ever be able to do it or anytime soon, was driving a car through traffic. And I see some of you are smiling now because I think many of you know that today there are machines that can drive a car through traffic. In fact, here's a picture of Andrew McAfee and me. We are grinning like idiots because we've just survived a ride down the highway in California, Route 101, riding in that autonomous car in the picture there. This is the Google driverless car. We rode it from Mountain View to San Francisco and back again with no human driver. And this is an example of how rapidly the technology has changed. Tasks that we thought were impossible in 2004 are commonplace. We actually rode the car in 2012. But it's not just driving a car. There are whole big categories that are rapidly changing right along the lines of the things that we thought would be difficult in 2003. Interacting with the physical world, like fine and gross motor control, language, and problem solving. Let me give you a couple of examples of each of them. So when it comes to interacting with the physical world, here's Baxter. We already saw that he may be keynoting next year. I think that would be interesting. Baxter is a robot developed by my colleague at MIT, Rodney Brooks, who's now at a company called Rethink Robotics. And Baxter, as you can see, works on assembly lines, picks up objects and moves them around. But Baxter is very, very flexible and can very easily be trained. You don't have to be a computer programmer. You just hold Baxter's arm and move it around, saying, pick this up, drop this off here, and it learns and recognizes what needs to be done with no special programming. Baxter costs a little over $20,000 US dollars. That works out to be less than $4 an hour working up to 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Rodney Brooks, the developer, thinks that it will bring a lot of work back to the United States and Europe and other high-wage countries because Baxter can work more cheaply than people in any of the low-wage countries elsewhere in the world. And that's current robot. A new robot that's also I've got to meet at MIT is this guy. This is Atlas. Atlas is about 2 meters tall, weighs about 300 pounds. What is that? 140 kilograms or so. Atlas is the project of the new DARPA Robotics Challenge, and there's a team at MIT and elsewhere working on it. What does Atlas do? Well, the last DARPA Robotics Challenge was to make a self-driving car. The new one is to teach Atlas how to walk up to a vehicle, get inside the vehicle, take the steering wheel, and drive the vehicle away. Then get out, pick up a fire hose, attach the nozzle to it, walk through a door, open the door, go in, go up some stairs, go across a rubble field, turn some levers, do a whole set of basic tasks that humans have been doing for years, but for the first time, machines will start doing. I should be clear that Atlas cannot yet do all those tasks, but that is the project over the next 3 years, and I talked to Gil Pratt, the director of the DARPA Robotics Challenge, and he was amazed. He said that the teams from MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon are way ahead of where he expected. Actually, the leading team, I should mention, is from Japan right now. It's a international competition. But you can imagine that once Atlas is able to do those tasks, think of how many ordinary jobs throughout the economy potentially could be done by robots that right now are infeasible for robots to do. That's motor control. The second one is language that we used to think was difficult. 10 years ago, it would have been science fiction to say that you go and you talk to your machine and it understands what you're doing. Now most of us have something in our pocket that we talk to, our cell phone, and we speak to it and give it instructions. And it's not perfect, but they're beginning to be the point where we can talk to our machines. I think we're in the midst of a 10 to 20 year period where we went from not being able to speak to machines to being able to routinely talk to machines and expect them to carry out our instructions when we tell them what to do. We also see that machines have gotten much better at translation. Now, luckily, those of you who are here understand English, so I can speak in English to all of you. But that's not true in every country. Rick Rashid gave a speech in China in English. It was translated instantaneously into Chinese while he was speaking, not by humans, but by a machine. One of the most exciting areas that surprised me and some of the people here at DTED and LECO was the way that machines are even writing news stories. Yes, here's, for instance, a sports story. I'm sorry it's not about World Cup football. It's about the popular sport in America, baseball. And the World Series, which is only played by Americans, was won last year by the Boston Red Sox, my hometown team. And this is a story that describes in detail one of the games, probably not of much interest to you, except for one thing about it. Look at who the author is. I hope you can read that there. The author is by the name of somebody called Automated Insights. That's not the name of a human, that's the name of a computer program. And it's not just tens of thousands of sports stories that are being written by this. If you go to Yahoo or elsewhere, you'll see many sports stories that you can read, and the authors are often either Automated Insights or another company, Narrative Science. Earnings reports. When Apple or Google or another company comes out with an earnings report, Forbes will publish these basic, fairly simple news stories written by robots, written by machines. That's today. It's easy to see the path of how this will evolve over time. But I think the most remarkable set of capabilities that shocked me over the past 10 years is what's happening in the area of problem solving. Being able to solve puzzles and problems and unstructured issues that previously only humans could do. I think the best example of this, perhaps, is the game show Jeopardy. Jeopardy is popular in America. I don't know how popular it is here in Brussels, but it's a questioning, answering game that could have questions about anything: sports, chemistry, music, popular culture, literature. And this particular question is about the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. I don't know if you guys know what the answer is to that, but you can think about that. This was the final question in the game show Jeopardy that was played between Ken Jennings on the left there, who won 75 games of Jeopardy in a row. Some people think he was genetically engineered to play Jeopardy from birth. I don't think that's true, but he was very good at it. Brad Rutter, who ultimately did beat Ken Jennings. And the one in the middle there, who looks a little different, that's IBM's Watson supercomputer, who played against them. And when they finally played the game, it was striking to see what happened. Before I get to the answer, let me show you this remarkable chart that Dave Ferrucci showed to me when he came to MIT. Dave is the father of IBM's Watson team. And those little dots, those little blue dots there, represent every single champion of the game show Jeopardy in all of its history. And you can see that most of them are clustered near the top because they tend to answer most of the questions accurately. That's the percentage of questions they got correct. And there's also fairly far to the right, that's how many of the questions they tried to answer. Those are the Jeopardy champions. Watson, when it was first developed, looked like this. It wasn't very good. It maybe got 25, 30% of the questions. It's a line instead of a dot because you can turn a dial on Watson and make it more aggressive or less aggressive. So essentially, you can pick any point on that line for any given game. Well, so Watson didn't look very competitive, but Watson did something different than the humans, which is that after 2006, when they first developed it, they continued to improve Watson. And a few months later, they came out with a new version, and then another version, and then another version. Like clockwork, every few months, they improved it. And by the time Dave Ferrucci showed me this chart at MIT, you can see Watson was already better than most human Jeopardy champions. A few months later, he went ahead and played Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter on national television. And in fact, Watson won that game. In fact, it won more money than Ken and Brad put together. And it did, in fact, answer the question correctly. The answer was Stoker, Bram Stoker of Dracula. But Ken Jennings had a good sense of humor about it. He not only wrote down the answer, who was Stoker, but he also added a parenthetical, I don't know if you can read it there, it said, "I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords." So that was his attitude towards it. But the thing about IBM's Watson is that ultimately that technology is not just being used to win $75,000 at Jeopardy. It has much broader implications. It's being used to answer questions in call centers. When people call in, Watson can help tell them what the answer is. It's being used for legal questions. It's being used for investment banking advice. It's being used for medical diagnosis. If Watson is not today the best diagnostician in the world, I think that within 5 years it probably will be. And when you want to have something diagnosed, you will want a second opinion or maybe even a first opinion from Watson as to what ails you. Machines are also hiring people. They're making decisions. I'm advising a company called NAC that has an automated algorithm for deciding who should be hired, who shouldn't be hired, and what jobs they should be allocated to. And the data suggests it's doing a much better job than the humans who were doing that job previously. And there are so many other areas in sports, in insurance underwriting, in politics, where these algorithms have shown to improve on human decision making. So what does all this mean for the economy? Well, I want to say that these changes that I just described to you that are coming in the pipeline, they are not the crowning achievements of the second machine age. They are not the final, ultimate ability of machines. They are just the warm-up acts. Technology is improving at an exponential rate. It's digitizing more and more of the world. The combinatorics of combining these innovations is allowing them to multiply their effect. So we will see even bigger changes in the next 10 years than we saw in the last 10 years. With that as prelude, let's look at what we have seen in the past 10 years and how the economy has changed. And I want to stress two broad kinds of changes. The first one, Andy and I call the bounty, the tremendous increase in wealth that we all have compared to before. Let me ask another question for the audience. How many of you right now have some kind of a device in your car that you carry with you that gives you turn-by-turn driving directions? So if you're driving, it will tell you when to turn left, when to turn right to get directions somewhere. How many people have such a device? Oh my God, almost everybody. Okay. How many people had such a device 10 years ago? A couple of people. So 10 years ago, that device would have been a standalone GPS device costing hundreds of euros. Today, almost everyone raised their hand because it's available essentially for free as part of your iPhone or your Android phone built in as one of the apps. And that's a small example of what's happening more broadly. This, let me show you this chart here on the left, if you can put it back up. That newspaper ad is an ad from 1993 for a company called Radio Shack, and a friend pointed out that almost every single thing for sale in that ad is now available for free in your smartphone. There's, of course, the calculator and the computer and the phone, the answering machine, if you guys remember what an answering machine was. There is the music player, although the current one has thousands of times more songs. There's the camera, the video player. All these things are bundled in as apps in your current smartphone. You don't have to pay thousands of dollars to buy them separately. And I should say the smartphone computer is a lot more powerful than the old computer was. Smartphones can now even help diagnose diseases. You can take pictures of a suspicious-looking mole on your hand, and it can tell you whether it's likely to be something you need to go to the doctor to, because it could be cancerous. In fact, there's a technology called CPath, computer-aided pathologist, which they've taught to diagnose breast cancer by looking at x-rays. On its own, it figured out how to diagnose the 8 main markers of breast cancer, the 8 key things that human pathologists are taught to look for to diagnose breast cancer. I think that's pretty remarkable. What's even more remarkable, it kept on learning, and it identified 3 additional markers of breast cancer that no human pathologist had ever recognized before. We call this the bounty because there's a tremendous increase in living standards. Our health is improved, we have wealth. Not all of it is visible because some of it's free, but it's still an increase in our living standards. In fact, if you look at all these goods and services here on this page, what they have in common is that they all became available in the past 10 years or so, and also they're all available basically for free on the internet. And because they're available for free, that means that their contribution to GDP is 0. We don't measure their contribution to GDP because if something has 0 price, then economists put 0 weight on it. Does that mean that they have 0 value? Of course not. They have tremendous value. Instead of buying Encyclopedia Britannica for hundreds or thousands of dollars, you can now go to Wikipedia for free. You're getting value that you didn't previously get. If you add up all that value and put it together, it adds up to about $300 billion per year in the US economy. And I'm sure a comparable amount in Europe, although the paper I did was really focused on the US economy. So all this bounty, some of it is invisible, but some of it is visible in the form of record levels of productivity, GDP, profits. They're all doing quite well. However, some statistics are not doing very well. For instance, employment. In Europe and the United States, the share of people working has been plummeting. In the United States, it's near a record low. Last week, we had an unemployment report that said that unemployment has fallen in the United States. However, if you look more closely, it was actually quite troubling. The reason the unemployment rate fell was not because more people were getting jobs. It's because more people have given up looking for work and dropped out of the labor force. Over 800,000 people in the United States in the last month gave up looking for work and dropped out of the labor force. So we had a huge decline in the employment to population ratio. So what's going on? How can we explain these trends? Well, the short answer is what we said in the previous book, Race Against the Machine, that these digital technologies are changing rapidly. They're advancing faster than I expected, and they're changing the way that businesses need to work. However, businesses are not changing the way that they are structured. Organizations are not adjusting. Our skills have not been updated. So there's a bigger gap than ever before between what the technology can do and what the technology demands versus what people are able to do. And that's leaving millions of people behind, because you need to have both the technology and the human side. And you see this in the data in terms of what we call the great decoupling. There are a number of important statistics that economists keep track of, like me, like labor productivity, employment, GDP, household income. And for most of the 20th century, they rose together. But in recent years, they've become decoupled. If you look at the last few years here of this chart, what you see is that GDP and productivity have continued to grow. We're not having problems there. The difficulty is that median income has become decoupled and employment has become decoupled. Median income is the income of the person at the 50th percentile, right in the middle of the income distribution. So you can have the overall distribution growing. The person in the middle might not get any wealthier. How can that be? Well, it could happen if most of the gains go to, say, the top 1% or some small group at the top. And in recent years, that's exactly what happened. Previously, the improvements in GDP affected all income groups. Recently, it's mostly affecting just one income group. And that illustrates a hard truth that really made me understand what was happening in the economy once I recognized this simple, basic truth, that digital progress can and does grow the pie. It does create wealth. It does make the economy as a whole wealthier. In fact, we hit in the United States record wealth of $80 trillion last month. Never been that high before. However, there is no economic law that says that everybody must share in that. It's possible for some people, even a majority of people, to fall behind. And although that's not what happened for hundreds of years, it is what's happened in the past 10 to 20 years. We see that in terms of what's happening in income inequality, where 1% of the people have had significant increases in gains, but almost nobody else has in the rest of the population. And the reason for that is what economists call biased technical change. Technology, when it advances, it doesn't have to help everybody. It could be that some people are made better off and some people are made worse off. We know that when the automobile was invented, that technology made most people better off. But if you happened to be someone whose job was making horseshoes, you probably were made worse off. And of course, if it's a small group of people who are affected like that, we can find ways of reskilling them. But more recently, it's been a larger group of people. There are three kinds of technical change that are important and that explain what's going on in the economy today. The first one is what economists call skill-biased technical change. The difference between high-skilled workers versus other people. The technology has been helping high-skilled workers versus other workers. Here's some amazing data from David Otter, and what you see is it tells a story. In the early part of the 20th century, there was a rising tide that lifted people of all education levels. Even if you had dropped out of high school, you still saw growing incomes. Then the oil shocks and the 70s recessions hit, and everybody got hurt a bit. But since then, there's been a spreading out, a divergence of outcomes, where people who have more education, who've gone to graduate school or college, have had their wages grow again, but the rest of the population has had their wages fall. And just so you can calibrate this correctly, the median worker in the United States is about where that green line is. Some college, but has not actually graduated from college. This is an illustration of skill-biased technical change. I see there are a lot of young people in the audience here. You may want to look at this before you decide whether to drop out of school. It's not just low-skill workers who are hurt, though. Actually, the people who have been hit the hardest have been the people in the middle of the income distribution. And this was another thing that was a little surprising to me when we first started working on this book. These U-shaped distributions show how much wages have changed for people from the lowest income to the highest income. And the other chart is how much employment has changed. And they're both kind of U-shaped. People in the middle have had the biggest drop in both wages and in employment. The paper that this is based on goes on to say that this is because those jobs have been the most hit by computerization. They tend to be jobs that involve routine information processing, basic information processing skills like clerks, tax preparers, bookkeepers. Those kinds of tasks are the easiest ones to computerize, and they've been among the first to be computerized. The ones at the high end that involve often creativity and invention have done very well. The other end also has done surprisingly well. Those are jobs like cook, gardener, hairdresser, nurse's aide. Those jobs have also been somewhat resistant to computerization because they involve some physical activity that robots have not been able to do yet. But we saw Atlas, and so I would never say never. It's certainly possible that more and more jobs will be affected. The second big change has been the changing shares of capital and labor. And Thomas Piketty has written about this in his recent book that's gotten a lot of attention. And what we've seen is that the share of income going to labor has been falling quite steeply in recent years, and the share going to capital, whether it's measured by profits or other categories, has been growing and is at a record level. Through most of the 20th century, they kind of bounced around depending on the business cycle, but recently the share going to labor has been falling very steeply, and that's not, that chart, if anything, underestimates how important this change is, because that labor share even includes soccer and football players and baseball players and musicians. So if you took them out, it would be falling even more rapidly for the average worker. And finally, the third category, which I think is the most important one, has been the bias of technology towards favoring superstars versus everyone else. Superstars in winner-take-all or winner-take-most markets. You see them like Lady Gaga, or this is Scott Cook, or Larry Merlo. These are technologies that allow an individual to replicate their insights or talents. Let's take a concrete example. Scott Cook is the owner of a company called Intuit. He's a billionaire. Intuit makes TurboTax, a tax preparation program. They've taken the process of tax preparation, they've codified it, and then they've digitized it. Once you digitize a process, you can make a copy of it. You can make 10 copies of it. You can make 100 million copies of it. And every one of those copies can be made almost for nothing, no cost. Every one of those copies is a perfect replica of the original copy. Every one of those copies can be transmitted anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world almost instantaneously. Free, perfect, instant. Those are three adjectives you don't apply to most goods and services, but they're common. In fact, they're standard in the digital world. Those are some weird and wonderful economics that you get when you digitize a process. Instead of a human tax preparer, perhaps with a college education doing the work, you can now have a piece of software doing the work. As a consumer, that's great news. It's much cheaper. It costs $39. For Scott Cook, that's great news. He's a billionaire. But for many tax preparers, for hundreds of thousands of tax preparers, they are not really adding much value anymore. What's the point of doing that when a piece of software can do a lot of what they did previously? That is happening to many, many industries. Those are winner-take-all or winner-take-most economics because you don't need to buy 100,000 different tax preparation software. One good one can be replicated and cover the entire market. Mark Andreessen famously said that software is eating the world. What he meant by that is these economics are coming to an industry near you. It's not just tax preparation. It's not just music. It's not just newspapers, the TED and LECO that are being affected by digitization. It's manufacturing and retailing and finance and media. Every industry is being affected by the same technologies at their core of digitization. And that means the same economics, these winner-take-all, winner-take-most economics. And we see this in the data again. We've got superstars taking off, getting a much bigger share of the income than previously. This is not, previously I showed you the top 1%. This is not a chart of the top 1%. This is a chart of the top 1% of the top 1%, the top 0.01%. And in the United States, they have a record share of income, but the same trend is visible in every country but two in Europe. It's Greece and Turkey. It's true in Japan, it's true in Korea, it's true worldwide. So we are seeing these trends happen in almost every developed country to a greater or lesser degree. So what is to be done? Let me leave you with a couple of closing thoughts, and then I think we can have a discussion or an interview. That self-driving car that amazed me, that was a response to the DARPA Grand Challenge, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency in the United States created a challenge to engineers that we challenge you to make a self-driving car that can navigate this course. And the engineers responded. The new DARPA challenge is Atlas, that robot that I showed you. The engineers are responding. I've met some of them. They're working all night long, weekends. They're passionate about trying to solve this challenge. I think we need a new challenge. I don't think the problem is that the technology needs to speed up. It's doing a great job. The new challenge is that our technologies will continue to accelerate, but it's our skills, our organizations, our economic institutions, they're what's lagging behind. So our challenge is to find a way to reinvent our organizations, to reinvent our society, to reinvent our economy, to live with these new technologies and take advantage of them. If we do nothing, the technologies will race ahead and millions, hundreds of millions of people, maybe billions of people will be left behind. We have to change the way we organize work so that we can use the technology in a way that creates shared prosperity. That's a difficult challenge. In the book, we lay out 3 chapters of recommendations of some of our ideas, but I hope all of you will start thinking about ways of addressing that challenge. And let me give you some inspiration or some optimism about how we might address that challenge. As you probably all know, the world chess champion is no longer a human. A computer, Deep Blue, beat Garry Kasparov in chess in 1996. And so Deep Blue is better than any human player. In fact, Deep Blue, we ran on some very powerful computer hardware, has been passed by new systems. Your cell phone, your smartphone that you have in your pocket, now has more computer power than Deep Blue and the supercomputers of the 1990s. In fact, when Jan Donner, you may know, the Dutch grandmaster, he was asked, what strategy would you use if you had to play a computer in chess? Jan Donner said, thought for a moment, then he said, I would bring a hammer. But it's interesting. While I said that the world chess champion is no longer a human, you should also know that the world chess champion is not a computer. The world chess champion is a team of humans and computers working together. Because after Garry Kasparov lost that game against Deep Blue, he organized a new kind of tournament where humans and computers could work together. He calls it freestyle chess. And teams would enter. And it turned out that the winning team did not have the most powerful computer. It didn't have the smartest grandmasters. What they had was a team of humans who knew how to work together and divide up the work. Some tasks the machine was better at, some tasks the human were better at. And today, knowing how to divide up the tasks is the key to winning in freestyle chess. I think that is a metaphor for what we need to do as a society. We need to work harder, not to try to stop the machines from beating us, not to race against the machines faster, but rather to race with the machines, to find a way that we can find other parts of our economic problems that can be addressed by having humans and machines work together. I think if we do that, the second machine age will be one of great bounty and not one of great inequality. And if we do that, we'll be able to create the kind of shared prosperity that I think we all seek. Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Erik. Have a seat.
Thanks.
Erik, can I offer you something to drink?
Thanks so much.
It's a test, just to be sure you're not a robot.
Pick it up, yeah, look at that, see that?
Cheers. First of all, Erik, thank you for stating in front of my shareholders that journalists can be replaced by computers. You will be so popular in the newsroom.
Not all journalists.
What I'd like to do with this short debate, Erik, is try to translate as much of your knowledge, of your wisdom, into practical guidelines.
Sure.
Just be aware, we have elections coming up in a couple of weeks, and a lot of our politicians are still looking for that one good idea. So anything you say can and will be repeated on television tomorrow.
Right.
Let's talk about those endangered jobs. There's something that in your explanation has stricken me, because you say, well, this room is full of C-level managers, entrepreneurs, bankers, stock traders, lawyers, board members, all jobs that can be replaced by computers. And you tended to say that we'll be in front of an empty room next year, but
well, Baxter will be.
You said it might well be that the job of their gardener is safer than the one of the people here in the room. Mm-hmm. But if that is the case, who's going to pay the gardener?
Yeah. No, well, this is the essence of a real challenge we had ahead of us, which is, first let me talk about the gardener. This is something that a professor at Carnegie Mellon University really said most eloquently, and it's been called Moravec's paradox, that it's often easier to automate the work of a high school or college or even PhD graduate than a 3- or 5-year-old, the basic tasks that we take for granted. And that remains to be true, although I think it's rapidly changing with some of these technologies. But I also want to say that there remain many categories where humans have a distinct advantage. Now, you should take this with a grain of salt, because 10 years ago I said driving was one of those categories. So, you know, things are constantly changing. But let me give you 3 broad categories where there continue to be some significant advantages for humans. One is in the creativity and innovation and intellectual tasks. Machines are still better at the simpler kinds of writing. Writing a more sophisticated news story, for instance, or feature story, is not something that I've seen any machine do, let alone a novel or a book-length serious manuscript.
Thank you for that.
Science. Yeah, so there's still, in fact, those kinds of tasks may become even more valuable. The second big category is interpersonal skills. It's not just a single dimension of intellectual, there's also a whole nother dimension of interpersonal interactions, whether it's motivating somebody, empathizing with them, caring for them, nurturing them. You know, most of us want a robot taking care of a 3-year-old or trying to give us a pep talk before a football game. That just really would be unlikely to work. Humans have special years of evolution, really, to learn how to connect to other people. And there are many jobs, whether it's a salesperson, a nurse, a leader, a manager, that require that kind of interpersonal skill. And the third category, still, is the one that you mentioned, is gardener, cook, hairdresser. The fine motor control just isn't there. I work with Baxter a little bit, and Baxter is impressive for those tasks that it can do, but it's still quite clumsy compared to a human. And navigating through a room like this with a tray of glasses or something, you know, may not be the most high-paid job, but it's one that is, for the medium term, relatively safe from robots.
What does all of this say about our educational system? Because if I listen well to what you say, we're teaching our children exactly the things computers can do better than us.
Yeah. That is one of my biggest frustrations, is that much of the educational system almost seems designed to stamp out creativity. If you look at a young child playing with blocks, they love to invent things, they love to be creative, and that's exactly what we need in the second machine age, people to be inventive and creative, to do the things that machines can't do. But the stereotypical classroom is rows of people sitting behind desks, quietly listening to an instructor telling them what to do, and if they try to be creative, they get yelled at. That might have worked for the industrial era, or maybe Henry Ford needed workers like that on the assembly line, but it's not what we need in the second machine age. We have to fundamentally reinvent education if we're going to be successful training the kinds of people that will be in demand.
Okay. One of the parts of your theory is that if we compare the technological evolution of today with what happened during the Industrial Revolution, you said we're only at the beginning of this ball game, of this new economic wave,
That's
meaning
right.
that the biggest effects are yet to come. So imagine, Erik, that you are the CEO of a media company with 2 financial dailies in a small European country. Just an example.
Okay. Let me try and picture what that would look like.
Knowing what you know, what would you do?
Well, it's a tough question, but I think that what you need to do is ultimately you need to embrace the digital age going forward. That, and I think that Ted and Leko have been very successful. We heard some of the stats of how they have been able to grow the digital products, I think 25-fold in the past 4 years, even while overall revenues were going up. That's not what most digital publications have been doing. They've been going in the opposite direction. They've been shrinking their revenues because of the increased competition. But what I see too many CEOs doing is trying to preserve the old, and too many bureaucrats in government and too many union leaders trying to preserve the old system, jobs, profits, and that's just an impossible losing battle. You have to be ready to embrace the new ones, which is a leap because you don't always know exactly how those are going to pan out. But it's a fundamentally different management approach that involves faster reaction, being more data-driven, embracing change, constantly updating, as opposed to optimizing the old system.
And raise the salaries of your creative journalists.
Well, that's something we'd probably need to do a little research on, but I'd certainly look into that.
Keep us posted. Erik, how, another point of view is the government's point of view and the authorities. How should they react on the phenomenon that we seem to underestimate the power of technological change? So imagine once again that you're a minister in a small European capital with a lot of international activity. Would you actually forbid initiatives like Airbnb and Uber?
Well, no, certainly not. I mean, I think you should be inviting them, and you should be encouraging local companies to come up with even better versions of that. And we see in my own hometown of Cambridge, they did try to ban Uber, and I know it was, there were delays in France. They had to have a 15-minute delay in Florida, elsewhere. And Airbnb is in battles with New York City. But there are some legitimate concerns around safety or taxes. But ultimately, I think most of these efforts at banning these companies are the old incumbents trying to protect their turf. And they should be, if a forward-looking government leader should be embracing change rather than trying to slow it down. Tim O'Reilly, I think, said it very well when he said that you cannot protect the past from the future, that that's a losing strategy. You need to embrace the future.
Mm-hmm. One of the images you use in your book is that when electricity came into play in the industry, you said, well, what engineers typically did was replace the steam engine by an electric engine instead of rearranging the whole process and well, rearrange people and the factory in its whole. You say that's exactly what we're doing now with the technological evolution of today. Where do you see that? Where are we misarranging technology and people?
Yeah, it was very surprising when I looked at the history about how the first big electric motors, instead of changing the factory and having a horizontal layout with individual machines, they just had one big electric motor with pulleys and hooked up like the steam engine. Today, when a company installs a new system like an ERP system, and maybe E&Y and other companies will help them with that, what we see is that it can take up to 5 to 7 years before they figure out all the complementary innovations, the changes in business processes that go with that new technology. Most of the productivity gains do not happen in the first 2 or 3 years. They happen over a longer period in some of the research that I've done. And the reason that it takes that long is that it takes that long to do the co-invention of the new business process. It could be a new incentive system, a reporting structure. It could be adding people in one part of the organization and losing people in the other part. But these are more fundamental organizational changes as opposed to simply snapping in the technology and continuing to do things the old way.
Okay. You mentioned already the book of Mr. Piketty in your speech about growing inequality. There's one striking difference between what you write about it in your book and what Mr. Piketty is saying. To put it in just one phrase, Mr. Piketty says it's all the fault of globalization and the wolves of Wall Street. And you say it is technology. The inequality, the growing inequality is in the hands of technology.
Right. Yeah, and so I think this is a little bit of a misunderstanding of Piketty, and maybe he bears some of the fault for this because people do read Piketty as saying that this inequality has come from the wolves of Wall Street and whatever. But if you look at the past 50 years, the growth in inequality has not been because of the increased savings and capital that he talks about in his book. That's a projection for what he thinks might happen in the next 50 or 100 years. But in the past 50 years, it's very clear, it's the things that I described here, this biased technical change where you've got individuals through their labor earnings that have become more unequal, superstars in various disciplines, skill-biased technical change. So at least for the past few decades, technology has been a much bigger driver of these fundamental forces. Now, going forward, people have different opinions. I look at the technology and I think that it's going to accelerate even more. Of course, no one can predict for sure what's going to happen, but I see some very big changes on the technological front that are already in the pipeline that will be rolled out over the next 5, 10, 20 years. Other people, Thomas Piketty, focuses less on the technological changes and believes that we'll start seeing a lot of wealth accumulation from savings. We'll have to see how that plays out over the coming years.
How do we make sure that that growing technology, that technological evolution grows inequality even more?
That it doesn't grow inequality even more?
Yeah.
So, well, first off, it starts with diagnosing the problem correctly. So it starts with an understanding of how technology, the superstar economics I described, the digitalization of every industry, what those dynamics are and how they lead to winner-take-all, power law economics, where there's a small group of people who can produce goods that can be rapidly replicated, not just with TurboTax, but you've seen it with WhatsApp or Instagram or many other types of products, and increasingly every industry. If you get the diagnosis correct, then that leads you to a set of prescriptions that involve, as we've already talked about, changing education in a fundamental way to boost creativity and reinvent it, get more people to be part of that creative economy. I think it involves more entrepreneurship, not because I think everyone will needs to become an entrepreneur. When you get laid off from one job, it's not that now you can go be an entrepreneur. That's not it at all. The reason we need more entrepreneurs is because we need to invent new goods, new services, new jobs to replace the ones that are being automated. Who in our society is in charge of inventing new goods, services, and jobs? It's generally not government bureaucrats. It's not professors, although I can try. The names of the people who we give who invent new companies, they're called entrepreneurs. They're the ones who create the new industries, like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Henry Ford, many others. They invented whole new industries. We need to do more of that. We're not doing it fast enough. And the third thing I would recommend is some fundamental changes in our tax policy. We can redistribute, reorganize income so that we have more shared prosperity, and we can do it in a way that encourages work through techniques. In America, it's called the Earned Income Tax Credit. There are negative income tax. There are other ways we can do it that will stimulate, encourage companies to create new jobs and encourage people to go out and work and take those jobs while also having a more equitable distribution of income. There are other things we could do, and I hope people in this room will think hard about how we can address these problems, because I think in the next 10 years they'll get much more severe. But the 3 chapters in my book where we discuss these recommendations, I think is one good place to start.
I liked your point about entrepreneurs, because more entrepreneurs is more need for financial daily, so I'm getting optimistic again.
I think that if you guys could provide the foundation to make it easier for people to learn about entrepreneurship, you'd be doing a good thing, not just for yourselves, but for society.
And we were going to end up in an optimistic way. I have one last question, Erik. We have elections coming on. Based on what you've studied and seen in technological changes, what kind of politician would you vote for?
So, I don't think this is a left or right type of question. I think the whole debate has mostly missed the point of what's going on. Most politicians that I've talked to, not just in the United States, but in Europe and Asia, fundamentally miss the point of what's going on in the economy. In the United States, we have the Tea Party that's angry about Washington waste. We have Occupy Wall Street that thinks there's some evildoers on Wall Street. And actually, there are evildoers on Wall Street, but that's not the main thing that's driving these big changes in the economy. Politicians, we need ones who understand technology and society and economics well enough to have the correct diagnosis of what's really going on. These tectonic changes are going to get even bigger going forward. I know for sure that the technologies that are in the pipeline will be rolling out and will be changing the world in a big way. What I don't know yet is how our economy is going to respond to that, but if we don't have politicians that even recognize the problem, let alone have solutions for it, then I think we're in big trouble.